pleased to see you again, Fritjof, after 1.5 years where we met for the first time.
It's a pleasure.
And the main reason I got in touch with you again was actually to talk about your most recent book, The Systems View of Life. And I was very pleased reading the book, and as you know, as a medical practitioner, I'm especially interested in the medical part of it.
Yes.
But I'd also like to discuss with you about the other chapters. Which was the most energy-consuming chapter for you writing the book?
This book is really a synthesis of my work over the last 30 years or so. As you know, I was trained as a physicist, and I began to write about the philosophy of modern physics, the philosophy of quantum theory. I compared this philosophy to the philosophies of Eastern spiritual traditions in my first book, The Tao of Physics. And then I branched out into other fields, and I realized that physics was not the right conceptual framework and not the proper source of metaphors for the issues that I became interested in, issues such as health or management, ecology, sustainability, and so on, because they all have to do with life. They have to do with individual organisms and with social systems and ecosystems. And so over the years I put together a conceptual framework that could deal with life in this broad dimension. And I discovered systems thinking, and I read Ludwig von Bertalanffy and the cyberneticists and so on, and then the more recent theories. And as I put together this conceptual framework, I published several books in various stages of the evolution of my thought. The Turning Point in '82, and then The Web of Life in '96, and The Hidden Connections in 2002. So this book, The Systems View of Life, is really a synthesis of this whole framework. So it was not a new book for me. What was new was the collaboration with an old friend, Pierluigi Luisi, who is a biologist at the University of Rome, and who is also very interested in philosophical aspects and in spirituality and the relationship between science and spirituality. So you asked what was the most difficult chapter. First of all, I would say his contributions were difficult for me to absorb and integrate, because he's actually a chemist by training, and there's a lot of biochemistry in the book. And a lot of it in the beginning I didn't understand. So I had to persuade him to express himself in a less technical language. But it's still a little technical, those chapters. So I would say for me the most difficult chapter was the one on complexity and order in the living world, where we talk about two linked phenomena, self-organization and emergence. And in the literature there's a lot of confusion about these concepts. Self-organization, the term self-organization, has had various meanings throughout the history of systems thinking. This idea arose in cybernetics in the 1940s, when cyberneticists studied networks for the first time, and then they built models of networks with little lamps that could switch on and off. And there were certain switching rules that say one node would be on only if two neighboring nodes were on, or something like that. And then they found, to their great amazement, that any random arrangement as a starting point would eventually result in ordered patterns. There would be waves going through the network, or there would be, cycles, or the whole thing would be off for a while, and there were just amazing patterns of order. And this emergence of patterns of order they called self-organization. Now, today we would call this emergence and not self-organization. Today, self-organization is understood as a mode of organization of a living system according to its internal rules. The system is not organized from the outside, but organizes itself. And that's the main characteristic of all living systems. And emergence is a particular process characteristic of all living systems, and in fact of all nonlinear systems, living or non-living, where the system is in a state of balance most of the time and is in a stable state or in a state of homeostasis. But every now and then there can be an instability of the entire system, which leads to the emergence of a new state of order. There's a spontaneous emergence of a new state of order, and this is nowadays often just called emergence. And to me, this is an extremely important discovery. It needs complexity theory or the mathematics of nonlinear dynamics to really be understood. And it has very far-reaching consequences. So in this chapter about order and complexity, we go to the very roots of these phenomena of self-organization and emergence in the biological, but even in the chemical, in the biochemical realm. And to really clarify this in the biochemical realm, which is the specialty of my co-author Luigi, that I think that was the most difficult and most unusual for me. At the same time, I think it's an extremely valuable chapter in the book.
I think it's very interesting what you're saying regarding how to integrate Luigi's work into the whole concept, because you're touching an important point, which is basically about communication. You had to communicate with him to make things simple,
right,
in order to make it that simple so that other people who are not within the field can understand it.
Yes.
So
and this is, I think, this is a characteristic of the whole book, because systemic thinking by its very nature is multidisciplinary, right, or you could even say transdisciplinary. And so we had to situate the book at a level that is, intellectually ambitious and sophisticated, but not too technical. And in the book, we in fact integrate 4 dimensions of life: the biological dimension, the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension. And those traditionally are represented by different academic fields: biology, cognitive science, the social sciences, and ecology. But we integrate this into one systemic framework.
The cooperation with Luigi itself is a certain degree of complexity, isn't it?
Yes.
So you communicate, you have your 2 people working together, and you try to integrate this part of him into the book. And you mentioned actually in the early years of systems theory that they were working with different lamps and they discovered certain patterns. So there's communication between the different elements involved.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Which is of course the case with living beings.
Yes.
So already within a cell, we have the different ingredients of a cell, and they
and it was very valuable for us to cooperate in this way, collaborate in this way, because we often had different perspectives.
Right.
My training is as a physicist, and then I branched out into philosophy and all kinds of other fields, and Luigi's training is as a chemist, and then he became a biologist. And so we were very fortunate in that we are old friends, And so we had a sort of ground rule that when we disagreed about a certain part that the other one wrote, we would try and negotiate. But if there remained a disagreement, and if the author was really passionate about this part, we would say, go ahead, put it in. I disagree, but put it in. Of course, disagreements were minor, there was no serious disagreement. And in fact, in one place, we actually mention in the book that we disagreed. So, but it was a very, very happy and very fruitful collaboration over many years.
I'd like to discuss just a little bit more the communication question. I've seen on your website that you're involved in lots of different fields and giving seminars for managers and so. So, to which point communication do you believe is important in order to find a certain state of homeostasis in an enterprise or in a biological system or in a social system?
Well, let me first say that I have been part of a global network of alternative institutions and alternative approaches to science, to philosophy, to politics, to healthcare. Alternative, I mean, compared to the mainstream. And this network began in the 1960s with the counterculture of the 1960s, and then moved on in the 1970s with the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, and also the New Age movement in the 1970s. Then it became a political movement with the emergence of green politics in Germany in the early 1980s. And then in the 1990s came the information technology revolution. And now these networks also were expressed in electronic networks. But networking, which is very, very popular now, and everybody knows about it and talks about it with all the social media and so on, this has existed long before the internet.
Right.
And in the 1970s, we had a global network of thinkers and activists, and I'm still part of that network. So in my work, I work a lot with people from all kinds of fields, and those are professional networks or semi-professional networks, and at the same time networks of friends. So there's an intellectual component and an emotional component. So when let me just mention a few names, people like Lester Brown at the World Watch Institute, who founded the World Watch Institute, or Hazel Henderson, the economist, or Vandana Shiva, the agroecological activist, or Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Those are all people I have known for 20-30 years. And now we have our websites interlinked and we communicate via email. But in the 1970s we didn't. We wrote each other letters and we visited each other. And we met at various conferences or stayed in each other's homes and so on. So, and personally, I have relied not only on these networks, but have relied on communication, and I would say on dialogue, for as a main tool of my research. When I wrote my first book, The Tao of Physics, I discussed the concepts of modern physics, which was my field, and then I discussed the ideas of Eastern spiritual traditions, which I gathered largely from reading books. I talked to a few people, but my main main source of knowledge was books, and I would say experience. Books and, you know, experience of meditation and various practices. But then I branched out and wrote The Turning Point, where I discuss biology, economics, psychology, ecology, and the change of paradigms from a mechanistic to a holistic or systemic perspective. And when I wanted to write a chapter about economics, I couldn't go to a university library and just read books on economics, because there are hundreds of them and I wouldn't know what to choose. So I was looking for people who are expert in the various fields and who share my basic premise and my basic set of values. And that was, to some extent, an intuitive process. I would, for example, give a lecture somewhere and somebody would ask a question, and I would think that's a really interesting question asked from a particular professional perspective with a lot of insight. And I would, you know, get into a discussion in public, but then afterwards I would go for a beer with this person and they would become colleagues and friends. So I have relied a lot on dialogues, and of course, I would also read books, but I remember when I wrote The Turning Point, I had a sort of personal rule that I would read a book only if it was recommended by two people whom I trusted, you know, and so that you know, was a selective process. So communication and dialogue has been extremely important in my work.
The communication issue is for me personally at the moment very important, because I also believe very much in dialogue, and which led me to an observation, which for me at least is very important. I see that the institutions, like, as you know, coming from the medical field, like hospitals, they're organized very vertical.
Yeah.
We have a chief physician and so on, where the flow of information is very, very often unilateral. Whereas we have in the area where I'm living a very interesting movement where we try to de-verticalize the medical field with a new concept which is very much supported by the politicians and supported with money and so on, where there is a more bilateral flow of information, and that's actually communication. You can't communicate in one way.
And I would even go further than that. And you know, in the book we have a chapter on, or a section rather, on management and on using the systems view of life to deal with human organizations. And this was also a very difficult one to write for me, except that I did the work already before writing this book. But in my previous book, The Hidden Connections, this was a real struggle. I'll tell you what the struggle was. The question, is a human organization a living system? And to what extent is it a living system? And I had lots of discussions with social scientists, organizational theorists, and finally realized that the answer to this question is yes and no, because every human organization has a dual character and a dual nature. It is a social institution that has been designed for a certain purpose, you know, deliver healthcare in a hospital, or manage political power in a political organization, or make money for the shareholders in a corporation, and so on. So there is a certain structure that has been designed, and in addition to that, there are informal networks of communications within every organization, because networking, and that is a very important discovery of systems thinking, that all living systems organize themselves in networks. That began, you know, with the first bacteria. As soon as they evolved, they formed networks, they formed bacterial colonies. So every human organization has informal networks where people build friendship, alliances, they help each other in their daily work, and they make daily life meaningful for each other with these informal networks. Now, these informal networks, which are now called communities of practice by organizational theorists, these informal networks are the living part of the organization because they are flexible, they can adapt, they can evolve, they show all the properties of living systems. And they always interact with the non-living part, the power structure, the organizational structure of the organization as documented in the official documents, budgets, rules, legal frameworks, and so on. And now, when you ask to what extent is a particular organization alive that is capable to learn, to adapt, to change, to evolve, it depends on how the living networks are accepted by the formal structures. If they are accepted, and not only accepted, but legitimated and encouraged and supported, then the organization will be very much alive. If they are suppressed, then something very interesting happens. The informal networks will still exist, but when people meet at lunch breaks or during the day of work, they would talk about football or about something else. They would not talk about matters concerning the organization. On the other hand, if the networks are acknowledged and empowered, they will talk about their daily work and will contribute. So that to me was a very important insight. And so coming back to the verticalization that you mentioned in your hospital, I would say it's not only bilateral contacts, but networks, contacts within networks.
So unilateral communication between all the people involved, or a maximum of people involved.
Yes, because these informal networks sort of intersect with the hierarchical official structure, and people participating in informal networks are not necessarily at the same level in the hierarchy of the official structure.
I think it's an observation of lots of my colleagues that we see that due to a lack of communication within the system, mistakes happen, and that can be a catastrophe for the patient. So the quality of communication, the flow of information within the institution, finally results in a higher quality of medicine, actually, in my field. When we had breakfast, you just told me that you have been in Bilbao, I think you said, where you have participated in a meeting with pharmacists.
Right. Well, this is a network of 400 pharmacists in Italy and Spain, and the name of the network is Apotheca Natura. And it was created by a company called Abuca in Tuscany, and they produce medicinal herbs. And so the pharmacists are their clients. And they created this network to promote a systemic approach to health and healthcare, a natural approach to health and healthcare, and also to promote sustainable agriculture, and in general questions of public health. And so the network was created 15 years ago, and in Bilbao they celebrated their 15th anniversary and had this big conference.
I'm asking this question because, as you know, I had the opportunity to found with a specialist in biochemistry, la doctrice Sandrine Hubert, and Claire Bestafeuille, in a foundation which we call the Physis Foundation. And Physis is the goddess of nature. Actually the idea of the foundation is a Swiss registered foundation, a non-profit organization founded in 2014. The purpose of the foundation is to support innovative concepts in the treatment of epidemic disease. So how do you see the movement of alternative medicine, which seems to be becoming strong and stronger the last 10, 15, 20 years?
Yes.
And in opposition to the classical approach of pharmaceutical companies who have a very Cartesian approach.
Yes,
basically.
yes. Well, first of all, let me say that the change of worldviews from the mechanistic view of the world, the Cartesian Newtonian view from the 17th century, to a holistic, ecological or systemic view of the world. This change has at its very basis a very profound change of metaphors, from seeing the world as a machine to seeing the world as a network. And in the book we then specify what kinds of networks, and these are living, self-organizing networks. Every living system is organizes itself as a network. And the contrast between these two kinds of paradigms is perhaps strongest in medicine and healthcare today. And the conventional so-called biomedical model is firmly rooted in Cartesian thought. Descartes in the 17th century wrote something like, I compare the human body to a machine. A well-functioning body is like a well-made clock. An ill body is like a clock that has something wrong, where a mechanism, doesn't quite work. Now, if you think of this imagery, then you will see that much of conventional medicine and healthcare is derived directly from this imagery. So doctors, instead of dealing with the entire organism, the mind and the body, embedded in a social and natural environment, would deal with a particular part, a particular organ, a particular cellular component, or even molecular and now genetic component. And to me, the key error in this conventional mechanistic medicine is a confusion between the process of disease and the origin. And so instead of dealing with the organism in the whole context and asking where does a certain illness come from and how can we remove the sources that gave rise to the illness, doctors would concentrate on the process, on the mechanisms through which the disease expresses itself, and then interfere with the mechanisms without dealing with the causes. And so the systemic view deals with the whole context of the illness within the context of life. So the fallacies and confusions in the biomedical model have been apparent for a long time. I remember in the 1970s there was a big movement exposing these problems of the biomedical model, and people talk about holistic medicine, or they talked about wellness, and there were very strong movements in this direction, and they continued through the 1980s, 90s and up to the present. And what we have now, I feel, is two parallel streams in healthcare. You have conventional medicine, which also has made tremendous progress within its own terms, with new diagnostic techniques, with new techniques of surgery, with a vastly expanded pharmacology. And it's very different from it was, a few decades ago. On the other hand, the alternative kind of medicine has expanded and is now widely accepted both in the media and in the population. So there are alternative health centers, doctors, journals, pharmacies, all kinds of organizations, which, however, are still not being recognized by the medical establishment. Now, as I mentioned, in the 1970s and the subsequent decades, various terms were used, like holistic medicine, energy medicine, alternative medicine. And it seems to me that in recent years the term integrative medicine has emerged as a sort of umbrella concept. And what they mean, integrative medicine, is a healing-oriented approach to health, which integrates the best of conventional medicine and the best of alternative, or as they call it, complementary medicine.
I'd like to come back to the book. In the book, I think it was chapter 14 or 15, you write about the system's view of health.
Yes.
Chapter 15, and you asked the question, what is health?
Right.
Actually, that would be the question which would connect those two different movements we have. You're talking about the alternative, more soft
yes.
approaches, where we have acupuncture, homeopathy, herbal medicine on one side, and we have the classical, conventional approach with drugs, very mechanically based approach. So both actually should share the question, what is health? Because in the middle of both we have the patient, right?
Yes, yes. Well, it's a sign of our academic world and our academic culture that these fundamental questions are very often not asked. When you study biology, for instance, you will not hear the question, what is life, asked by your professors. Should be asked in the first lecture of the first year of biology, because biology is the science of life. So what is life? The same, I've spoken with doctors who told me that never in medical school were they discussing the concept of health. What is health? I recently met a neurologist in Los Angeles who is a specialist in mental health, and they would never ask what is the mind. Although mental health is the health of the mind, and they never asked what is the mind. So, of course, our whole book, The System's View of Life, centers around this very fundamental question, what is life? And the answer in terms of biology first, but then we expand it to other dimensions of life, the answer that life is not contained in a particular structure, a particular molecule or a particular structure, but is a particular pattern of organization. And we go into quite some detail, first noting, if you ask what's the difference between a rock and a plant, or microorganism or animal, so a non-living and a living system. One thing you could say right away is every living organism consists of cells. There are no cells in the rock, but living organisms are either individual cells like bacteria, or they are multicellular organisms. So then you can proceed with an approach that has been very successful in science of looking for the simplest living system, and then to say, what are the fundamental characteristics of life in the simplest living system, which is of course a cell. So we can ask, what is a living cell? What is the defining characteristic of a living cell? And the answer is, it's a certain pattern of organization. It's a certain way in which the parts work together. And you might think, in fact, that you can say a cell is composed of macromolecules like proteins, DNA, lipids, and so on. And those are the fundamental characteristic of life. But the problem with this sort of DNA-centered definition, where you could even say, a living system is a chemical system that contains DNA. It sounds very simple, but when this organism dies, the DNA doesn't go away, as you know, it stays there. So a dead organism also contains DNA. So the essence is really in the process of life, in the metabolism. A living system is a system that metabolizes, and this metabolism is the continuous flow of energy and matter through a network of chemical reactions that are organized in such a way that it allows the organism to continually maintain, repair, and perpetuate itself. And this particular organization, which is technically known today as autopoiesis, or self-production, self-making, that's the literal translation. So it is a network that continually makes itself, that continually produces its and replaces its own components. That is the systemic definition of life. And then we go on in the book and describe this living network in more detail. And the first thing, which I should also say that this theory of autopoiesis was created by two Chilean biologists, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And what Maturana, who first had this idea, what he realized right away, that there is a certain circularity. He in fact called it a circular organization before calling it self-organizing and autopoietic. And the circularity arises because each part of the network is produced by the network, and then as soon as it is produced, it contributes to organizing the network and to producing other parts. And because of this circularity, these circles or cycles or loops also act as feedback loops. And as you know, there are two kinds of feedback. There's the self-balancing feedback, and then there's the self-amplifying feedback. This was already discovered and elaborated in the 1940s in cybernetics. And because of this feedback, the network can regulate itself, and it does so by remaining in a state of continuous fluctuations. So this is a very important insight, that all living systems fluctuate. Because they fluctuate within tolerance limits, they have this capability of self-regulation, of self-balance, of homeostasis, and the more dimensions of fluctuations there are, the more flexible the organism, and this is immediately relevant to the concept of health. So now let's move from the systems view of life to the systems view of health and just ask the question, what is health? Again, I asked this question a long time ago in my previous books, in one of them, in The Turning Point in the 1980s. And the main stumbling block and then the main insight was the realization that health is not something that can be defined exhaustively in technical terms, because it is first and foremost an experience. It's an experience of well-being, which can be intuited. We know intuitively whether we are healthy or not. And if you then want to describe what is a healthy organism, the most general you can say is that when an organism functions in a certain way, that's healthy. When it functions in a different way, that's unhealthy. Well, how does it have to function to be healthy? It depends on how you describe the organisms, right? If you describe it as a clock, then you would say, well, all the parts work, everything is well oiled, you know, and ticks away. That's a healthy clock, or a healthy, you know, mechanistic view of a healthy organism. When you describe it as a living system that is self-organizing, that is a living network, the situation is very different. And so there I am starting from the fact that living systems, living networks are continually fluctuating, and I say health is a state of dynamic balance. A dynamic balance that involves both the physical and the psychological dimensions of the organism, and also involves its interactions with the natural and the social environment. So there you have actually the four dimensions of life in this definition. The biological dimension, you know, the physical aspects of the organism, the cognitive, the psychological aspects, the social interaction with the social environment, and the ecological, the natural environment. And dynamic balance is a very general term, but if you then go into it, into detail, you see that it's this autopoietic network which has feedback loops and which has an inherent tendency to stay in balance. And this is something very well known in healthcare, that minor illnesses cure themselves. For instance, if I were to go on talking to you now for 3 hours without drinking any water, you know, I would, and maybe not having slept much the night before to make it more extreme, more physical stress, I would end up with a sore throat. Now, I don't have to see a doctor, because my body tells me, you have done too much of this. I stop talking, I may lie down, you know, stay in bed for a day, or even just rest, and the sore throat will go away. I may take some vitamin C, but even without it, the sore throat will go away, because the organism heals itself. And those natural healing forces have a long tradition. This term has a long tradition from the Hippocratic writings on, through various folk medicines and so on. So this is now confirmed in and given a scientific basis in the systems view of health, because we know that living organisms are fluctuating, they have feedback loops, and they are able to heal themselves. Now, the interesting part here is the two kinds of feedback, the negative and positive. Negative is the maintaining, the self-balancing kind, and the positive, this is the self-amplifying. A state of ill health can also be self-amplifying and then leading to a state of crisis. And here comes the big discovery of complexity theory. A state of crisis may either lead to a breakdown, or more frequently it may lead to a breakthrough, to a new state of order or a new state of health. Now, to go through this process, usually we need somebody to accompany us, and this attendant is actually the original meaning of therapy, and the therapist. Therapist as an attendant from the Greek word therapeuin, to attend to the natural healing forces. And so in this pathway of crisis and of a new state of health emerging, we often come across reports of people who go through life-threatening illnesses and then go through the state of crisis. They change their whole lifestyle and they come out feeling healthier than they did before the crisis. So all this is connected in this notion of health as dynamic balance.
You have given a very broad summary about what is health, and I totally agree that in the medical school, like Vienna Medical School, which I appreciated, we hardly discussed this question.
Yeah.
And if you come up with such a question,
Yeah.
it's rather it's not an issue. It's
Yeah.
just you get a response, but it's not very satisfying. But I had a personal experience when I was quite young, maybe 16 or something like that. And I went to a school where I had subjects I didn't like. But what I did actually was I just didn't attend certain subjects. I went to the forest. And being there in the forest, I still have the images in my brain. I was surrounded by this incredible environment of living organisms.
Yeah.
Everything seemed to be connected, and it
Yeah.
was so inspiring for me to experience that. And I think that had a very profound impact on me. You are the founding director of the Center of Ecoliteracy
Yes.
in Berkeley,
Right.
where you do what exactly? I imagine always it is actually about giving trainings and sensibilizing young people or people generally about nature.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We take children out. We work with schools, with elementary schools and high schools, but more with elementary schools than with high schools. We take children out into nature, and we don't take them to the forest. We could, and there is actually a school. I don't remember where it is now. Which is called the Forest School. I think it's in Brazil, but I'm not sure. Anyway, we take kids out into nature, and we were looking for the proper ecosystem to introduce children to, and we found two. One is gardens, and the other one is creeks, small rivers. And I think most of us, especially those of us who have grown up in the country, will remember experiences of a garden and experiences of a waterbed, a creek, as something magical where you love to play. And so this is something, there's a natural kinship between children and those ecosystems, because they're just the right size for a child to orient herself or himself. And so what we do is we have schools that have gardens where children go out and plant flowers and vegetables and learn ecology, the basic principles of ecology, in a hands-on approach, with their fingers in the earth, so to speak. And we also have schools where they go into creek beds and do creek restoration and study watersheds. So we do both. Now, the basic purpose is to introduce ecology and systemic thinking into the school curriculum. Mm-hmm. And we do this in a very central way. We don't have a separate discipline of environmental studies, but ecology animates and systems thinking animate the entire curriculum. So the garden is at the very center of the school, and each class in a school of say 300 students, each class would spend 2 hours a week in the garden, and they would learn about life cycles, about solar energy, about photosynthesis, nutrients in the earth, and so on, by planting and harvesting food. Some schools also have kitchens where they cook, and they learn a lot of culture. In California is a very multicultural state. So in the schools there are African American kids, there are Asians, there are Indonesians, children from all over the world. And so sometimes one little girl would bring her grandmother who would cook a Vietnamese dish, So they learn about geography, they learn about history, they learn about culture. So the garden and the kitchen are at the center of the whole school.
Right. I think that's very, very beautiful, and it's interesting that the place I'm living in Montreux in Switzerland is also very, very international. We have similar tendencies, I would say, in schools, even in public schools. So would you say that actually bringing our children in touch with nature and being linked to nature actually has an impact, a long-term impact on our attitude towards health?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, first of all, it has an impact on our attitude toward nature. And what we try to do, our approach is experiential, because if you just teach ecology as a subject, with the blackboard and the classroom, you might at the end have students who are first-rate ecologists but don't care about nature because the emotional component is not there. So we want to emphasize the emotional component. And I know that from my own experience, when you have this emotional component, that stays with you for your whole life. I grew up in Austria on a farm. I spent the first 10 years of my life on the farm, running around barefoot during the whole summer, having my own, together with my brothers and cousins, we had our own little plot where we planted our radishes and tomatoes and so on. We recognized, plants and bugs and various animals, the flora and fauna of the region. We knew it intimately, and that memory has stayed with me. So I'm now over 70, so that's 60 years and more back in the past. But I could draw you a map of our farm, and I could tell you where the potatoes were and where the strawberries were and the rhubarb and the chamomile bush and the various other apples and pears and cherries. I still have this in my head after all these years. So I know that when you have this emotional contact, this relationship with nature stays.
The reductionist approach in medicine and the separation of the mind and the body is, I think, most obvious in the separation of the treatment of psychiatric disease and somatic disease.
Yes.
And you have written in the book in an excellent way, I would say, about the emergent properties, and that cognition actually is part of a certain complexity of a system.
Right. Yeah. Well, the separation of mind and body, of course, goes back to Descartes. Descartes' main ansatz was to divide nature into two independent and separate realms. That of mind, which he called the res cogitans, the thinking thing, and that of matter, which he called the res extensa, the extended thing. And following Descartes, scientists and philosophers kept thinking about the mind as a thing, because Descartes called it the thinking thing. And then they wondered and couldn't figure out how this thinking thing interacted with the body, in particular with the brain, but also with the body as a whole. And the main advance and the main breakthrough of the systems view of life has been to realize that mind is not a thing, but a process. That was the main breakthrough. And that was realized in the 1960s, independently by Gregory Bateson, who was part of the cybernetics movement, an anthropologist and one of the outstanding systemic thinkers of the 20th century, and by Umberto Maturana. And Maturana, with Varela, then completed this notion of mind as a thing, which is nowadays called cognition, and which he called cognition, the process of knowledge, of knowing. And they elaborated a whole theory of cognition at the University of Chile in Santiago, which is now often known as the Santiago theory of cognition. And the very essence of the Santiago theory of cognition is to associate the process of cognition with the very process of life. Cognition, in the view of Maturana and Varela, is the self-organizing activity of those living autopoietic networks. So the very process of life, the very process of self-organization is a cognitive process, and the interactions of these living networks with their environment are cognitive interactions. And so this resolves the age-old dilemma about the relationship between mind and brain, for example, with one stroke. In the Santiago theory, this relationship is very clear. Mind is not a thing but a process. It's the process of cognition, the very process of life, of self-organization, and the brain is a particular structure through which this process operates. So the relationship between mind and brain is a relationship between process and structure. So this is very clear. And then you can transfer this to the systems view of health, where there is a momentous change in thinking, and which can lead, well, first let me say that if you see health as a self-organizing process, I said before, a state of dynamic balance which has the potential to keep in balance, to heal itself. In other words, the process, health is a process, and it is very closely associated with the whole self-organizing process of life. And since the very dynamics of this self-organizing process is identified with cognition, you can say that the process of getting sick and getting well is also a cognitive process. So you have a very tight coupling between the biological or somatic aspect of health and the cognitive or psychological aspects. In other words, the concept of psychosomatic can be extended to the entire process of life and the entire process of health. So every illness has a cognitive component, even though this may not be conscious to the patient or the doctor, hopefully to the doctor, but not necessarily to the patient. The very process of getting sick and getting well is a cognitive process, and so psychosomatic medicine should not be a special branch of medicine, but all of medicine and healthcare should be psychosomatic, addressing the cognitive and the biological aspects of health. And so the relationship between those two parts of psychosomatic, between psyche and soma, is the same as the relationship between mind and body. It's a relationship between process and structure.
Well, can we just discuss and maybe distinguish two different terms? You're talking about cognition, and what is the difference for you between cognition and consciousness?
Well, consciousness is a particular... Let me first say, cognition applies to all living systems. All living systems are self-organizing autopoietic networks. Whether or not they have a brain and a nervous system. Plants, for example, don't have a nervous system, but they are self-organizing processes, and therefore they are cognitive. So, a plant or even a microorganism is a cognitive system, and in evolution you get more and more complex structures, and so the process part, which is cognition, also gets more and more complex. So with the biological evolution, there's also a cognitive evolution. And evolution then, going through the various species, arriving at the mammals, say vertebrates and then mammals, involves a nervous system and a brain, and as the brain gets more complex, the cognitive process gets more and more complex, and at a certain level, which is the level of the great apes and then hominids and humans, but maybe also at earlier levels, a new phenomenon emerges, the phenomenon of self-awareness. Every living organism is aware of the environment in the cognitive process, because perception of the environment is a key to cognition. But not every living organism is aware of being aware, is self-aware. So this self-awareness emerges at a certain stage of evolution, and this is what is known as consciousness. Now, different people use consciousness in different ways, but that's how I use consciousness. So consciousness is a particular kind of cognition that emerges at a certain level of complexity, which requires a brain and a higher nervous system.
Which would be basically saying a 6-month-old baby has no self-awareness, right? Because the complexity is not that evolved, whereas the 6-year-old has self-awareness. The ego is already present.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So,
and monkeys, for instance, don't have self-awareness, but apes do. The great apes do.
Right. So I would go even further, and I've become very interested, my wife as well, in the work of Stanislav Grof, and you have written in one of the former books about Stan's work, and he did a lot of work with psychedelic substances, where he went even further to the classical term of consciousness. You're very precise how you use the word consciousness. I think that's very helpful in the separation between cognition and consciousness. And Stan, with his work, he goes very far, even into spiritual experiences. What would then that be from a systemic point of view, a spiritual experience?
Well, in the book we have a whole chapter on science and spirituality, and I've been very influenced in my thinking by a Benedictine monk, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is also Austrian, and who goes back to the original meaning of spirit, which from the Latin spiritus means breath. And so, interestingly, this is also true for the related word anima, the soul, and it's also true for psyche and for the Sanskrit Atman. All these words in these ancient languages mean breath. So this ancient intuition of spirit or soul is a notion of the breath of life. So Brother David says our spiritual moments are those moments when we feel most alive, in an intense feeling of aliveness, which can be during meditation, it can be during sports, skiing or tennis or whatever sport you do. If you really go very far, you have these rare moments of intense aliveness, or listening to music, in looking at a work of art, in a sexual experience. All these are examples of intense aliveness where the difference between mind and body disappears. You're no longer aware as having a body, but you are an organism, mind and body. And even the difference between the self and the outside world disappears. I mean, in the sexual experience, this is the most obvious, because there's this intense interactions between two human beings. But also I've had this experience skiing, where in the perfect condition, the perfect weather, the perfect slope and so on, and my physical condition was just perfect for the occasion. And so I experienced skiing. There were no more skis, no more slope, no more gloves and poles and body, but it was just rhythm and movement. And I was sort of losing myself in the rhythm and movement of skiing. So these are spiritual experience where these distinctions disappear, and as Brother David says, you experience yourself as a unity of mind and body and a unity of self and other. And it's interesting that in the world's spiritual traditions, there are many descriptions of these experiences that share these common characteristics that I just mentioned. Now, it's very important in my view when you compare science with spiritual traditions to make the distinction between spirituality and religion. And this is something where people often get confused because they fail to make this distinction. So in the book we are very careful in making this distinction. So spirituality is an experience of aliveness that does not depend on historical or cultural contexts. Religion then is the organized attempt of explaining this experience, of interpreting the experience, and of using it as a basis for moral guidelines for the religious community. And so that all depends on the historical context and on the cultural context. And the mistake that people make is that they compare science with religion rather than science with spirituality.
So the experience of unity, where separation doesn't exist anymore, would be, from a systems theory point of view, would mean actually being integrated in a larger context.
Yes, yes, and this is very much borne out by system science, because we know today that we share life's basic molecules with all living systems. I mean, every leaf on a tree has the same types of proteins, has the same types of amino acids, of lipids, of membranes, of nucleic acids. All these are the same macromolecules. But not only that, also the metabolic pathways are very similar. So we share all this with all other living beings. Moreover, when we die, these molecules do not disappear, but they are recycled and they will appear again in other systems, living or non-living. So in a way, when I die, my body does not die, because it will live on in other bodies, living or non-living.
It will become reintegrated.
It will become reintegrated. So it's a really very strong recognition of the fact that we are not thrown into a random universe, but we are part of a great symphony of order in which we are integrated. And I think this, to a scientist or a spiritual person, is a source of great comfort and a very profound meaning.
I had an experience recently at work, and I have a patient. He's a former French Legion. He worked for a French Legion 20 years, and he said, I knew him for 2 years, but never told me. He told me that he had 3 near-death experiences. Yeah. So he said, I really observed my body from above and could hear what's going around. What's going around in the bloc opératoire, the
operating room.
And
operating theatre, they call it actually.
Operating theatre, and from a systems theory point of view, is there any idea how to explain that something is reincarnation, for instance? That would be another issue. Is that coherent with a systems theory point?
Well, I think here we really reach the edge of contemporary science, because this whole integrated view of life and cognition is only about 40-50 years old, and so it's very recent. And I think we can make connections with say, Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, or Stan Grof's work, or reincarnation. I'm not sure about reincarnation, by the way, but naturally this integrated systems view will be extended to make contact with these other phenomena, but that hasn't been done yet.
The discussion we have had so far is very much about, is actually interdisciplinary discussion. What you're explaining is that you have learned a lot about other fields by approaching them proactively, and you've learned from them. And do you see in science currently a movement where we go more, where we have been very reductionist the last 100 years, by becoming more, developing more approach where we try to do synthesis and to try to communicate more in an interdisciplinary way?
Well, there's certainly a movement of interdisciplinary work and of synthesis, but there are many obstacles, because the academic world is organized along disciplinary lines. If you want to have a cátedra as a professor, if you want to be have tenure as a professor, you have to be a professor in a certain discipline. If you want to publish your work in a credible journal with a high reputation, it's a very narrowly defined journal. And so these ideas that we expressed in the systems view of life are transdisciplinary ideas, and we would have a very hard time publishing them in a scientific journal. However, I should mention that the book is published by Cambridge University Press, which is one of the leading academic publishers, and they were suspicious when we proposed the book. And what they did is they sent it out to reviewers, to maybe a dozen reviewers, and they got enthusiastic responses. And that's why they published the book. So there is a trend toward more interdisciplinary work. And I think there are two, I can see two reasons for that. And there are two key concepts of the systems view of life: networks and complexity. Everybody today knows that we live in a networked world, that networks are extremely important. And so since this is the very core of the systems view of life, this is being accepted. And everybody knows that we live in a complex environment. And so if you talk about complexity theory and notions of complexity, that's also at the forefront of science and is recognized as something serious and scientific. So I think as time goes on, these trends will get stronger. A good example is in genetics, the Human Genome Project of maybe 10 years ago or whenever it started, where geneticists very successfully mapped the entire human genome and realized then that their initial goal, their initial dream of being able to identify certain sections on the DNA, that is certain genes with certain diseases, and then maybe develop a kind of genetic medicine, that didn't work out. Because knowing where a gene is located is one thing, but knowing how it operates is a totally different thing. Because there's actually a whole genetic network, and not only that, there's an epigenetic network, and in the book we talk about epigenetics, where the entire cell is involved, let alone the fact that it's very difficult to define what a gene is. So this whole so-called genetic determinism has seen its day and is now being replaced by networks and complexity.
Where the idea of explaining actual life just on the basis of genetics, we see that it's not possible. We need a larger concept. I think that was a very, very interesting discussion, Is there something which you'd like to share, and which seems to be very important for you? From a personal,
I think what is important for me is that there is a whole other realm. Naturally, our focus has been health, medicine, healthcare, but extending it to the social realm and to the political realm, we can say that systemic thinking is extremely important also in the social and political realm, because what we are realizing more and more is that the major problems of our time are all interrelated. Whether we talk about health or energy or climate change or social justice or economics or management, all these problems are systemic problems, which means that they cannot be solved in isolation. They need systemic solutions, which are solutions addressing a problem, particular problem, within its larger context. And therefore, the hallmark of a systemic solution is that it solves several problems at the same time. And let me just give you one example from agriculture. If we moved from our industrial system of agriculture, which is chemically based, which is highly centralized, involves a lot of machinery and therefore very energy intensive. If we shifted to organic, community-oriented, sustainable farming, then this would solve three major problems that we have. First, it would save a lot of energy, because the industrial agriculture is very energy intensive. Secondly, the healthy organically grown food would have a tremendous impact on public health, because, as you well know, many of our diseases are directly related to diet, diseases such as diabetes or strokes or others. And thirdly, it would be a significant contribution to alleviating climate change, because an organic soil is a carbon-rich soil, and therefore it draws down carbon from the atmosphere. And it's worth noting that storage of carbon in the soil through photosynthesis, either in sustainable agriculture or which is now often known as agroecology. So storing carbon dioxide in the soil in agroecology or in forestry by planting trees is the only known technology of drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere. We have to do so. We have passed the healthy 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We are up to 400. We need not only to reduce emissions, but also to reduce the existing CO2 in the atmosphere. And agroecology is the only way known and proven to do so. So those are all different effects of one and the same solution, a systemic solution.
It has been a great pleasure
to
see you again.
My pleasure, and I'm really happy that you can apply these views of the systems view of life very concretely in your field. And I find your experience in Africa especially enlightening, and what you're doing now. So I wish you all the best for
Thank
your
you
project.
very much.
Thank you.
All the best for you
All
as
right.
well.